emigration from Australia, and it links with diasporas that we were talking about last week. So it's really a continuation of viewing people leaving, if you like, and then their roles within different countries from their home country. So immigration, I'm just going to look at where Australians are abroad, who are they, and also look at some of our survey of Australian graduates living abroad we did in early 2000s. Diagrammatic presentation of different national populations. The grey really represents present in a country at a point in time. It's usually indicated at national censuses, the stock of people, and it can actually be permanent residents, citizens, and others with resident status. Outside of that, there's also others. So they can be student populations, they can be also, working holiday makers, other visitor groups. Absent from the country, down here, we can have the citizens absent at a point in time, and others with permanent resident status that aren't living in the country at a particular point in time, that are overseas. So these groups represent, if you like, our diaspora. How do we really classify a diaspora though? What's the one thing that we need to use with diaspora? That those overseas people still have links with the home country, or an identity with their home country to actually form a diaspora. They can be called expats, expatriates outside the country, or they can just be Australians overseas who have no links, or maybe don't want to have links with their home country. So how do we measure immigration, out-migration? Department of Immigration and Border Protection have the overseas and arrival and departure data, and everybody that leaves the country has to fill in a card. Everybody that comes into the country has to fill in a card. Not all countries have immigration data, because they don't make you fill out a card when you leave the country. This provides us with estimates of Australian residents permanently departing, because on those cards you'll be asked your intention to stay, how long overseas, less than 12 months, 12 months or more, or you intend to permanently settle overseas. So on that outgoing passenger card, we use people's intentions. So I intend to leave for 6 months. You termed a short-term departure. I intend to leave for over 12 months. I'm going to study in England or study in the US or wherever, but I'm going to be returning. Or I intend to live permanently overseas, settle overseas. Okay, so those intentions are what some of this data are based on, but clearly intentions can change once people actually get somewhere. It takes no account of the changes in intentions. We're unable to ascertain if those Australian-borns emigrating are more likely to return, or that overseas departures, overseas people in Australia departing are likely to return, or whether they're younger or they're older or whatever. So we can't actually look at those intentions and actually provide some of the information we actually need. But we do know from the intentions what the thoughts were when people did leave Australia. Immigration levels. Overseas born in particular have had high and low immigration levels. So this is people in Australia overseas born. There's been periods with quite high out migration and other periods with lower migration. what appears to happen if you have very high permanent arrivals in a period, 2 years to 5 years later, you often get a spike in departures, meaning that influx of people coming from overseas looked as if didn't suit them or whatever, looks as if they're going 2 or so years later. In other words, a small but significant number of people chose to leave within 2 years, and that's been a common pattern across when records have been kept in the post-war period. In recent years, or last decade or so, Australian-born residents have been departing in greater numbers as well. This trend is likely to continue as a result of the increasing internalisation of labour markets and global demand for skilled workers. And I'll talk a little bit later about the immigration study we did, which was out of government's concern about why were all these Australians, young Australians leaving, young Australian graduates leaving indeed, and they were on the rise. So this is permanent departures on the card. They've said, I'm departing permanently, and this is Australian born and overseas. So back here, the open bars, overseas born, much more common for the overseas born to leave, particularly in the early 70s to mid 70s. That, by the way, was when the Labor government was in power, but it doesn't necessarily relate to politics, it's more like economic situations at times. And then you see, this is the dark bands. Up until about 2000, you'll see this hike all of a sudden in Australian-born persons leaving permanently, supposedly, matched with, again, increasingly numbers of overseas born as well. And remember 95, 96. What happened in 95, 96?
Temporary.
Yeah, so we actually had much more opened up temporary visas and much more flexibility in migration. And that was in response to the worldwide situation as well, so greater mobility generally of people and able to actually move country. So departures increasing overall, but over half of the departures happened to be Australian born, which was very different than earlier decades. Where were those Australian born persons intending to reside? Well, the big grey circles are actually New Zealand, United States and UK, but you can see through this corridor and down through Asia and Indonesia, etc. above us, that clearly there's very much a passage of departures going to very concentrated areas. These are just permanent departures to ASEAN countries or Southeast Asian Rim countries. And again, this is from 2000 on, and the dark ones are Australian born, and a lot of Australian born departures were to Asia, and also overseas born departures also to Asia. And that's a lot of the increasing migration between Australia and Asia occurring in that time. Selectivity of immigration. This is the Australian-born group I was chasing in 2012-13. So what's so distinctive about that pyramid? It's not a pyramid anymore. Looks like a tree, but anyway. What is really distinctive? Who are these people leaving? Who are all these?
Probably families.
Yeah, they're families, because they've got children. It's really the young adults, family formation groups, and their children, because obviously 0 to 4s don't migrate by themselves out of the country. Clearly they're the children of. It's not so much, is it, the top end of the pyramid, it's very much in those 30, 40-year-olds. So in terms of the 91 odd thousand people departing, 52% were overseas born. Largest group were New Zealand born, 10% of all immigrants. Remember, New Zealand born, and I'll talk about New Zealand migration on Thursday, but clearly the non-visaed migration so much more readily happening between Australia and New Zealand. United Kingdom born, second largest group, 8.2%. China born, 7%. Hong Kong born, 2%. US born, about 1.something%. The majority of those groups were returning to their home country. New Zealand in particular, 81% of them, it was their home country they were returning to. Hong Kong, 75% of them, they were returning to their home country. USA, 69%, UK, 57%. So some of that's saying they were leaving Australia. Most of them were going back to their home countries or returning to where they came from. Some of them, like the UK, obviously moving on to other countries, not necessarily going back to where they came from. Immigration by the Australian-born, 43,423 Australian-born people departed, includes the Australian-born children of former settlers. So in other words, they have children in Australia, they get counted as part of that Australian-born movement. But they really attached to families who were born elsewhere. Australian-born were emigrating specifically to the UK, United States or to New Zealand. There were three main destinations, and basically about a third of them went to those destinations. So those three countries by far were the most popular destinations. Next most popular was Singapore, 10%, Hong Kong, 5%, and United Arab Emirates, about 4.6%. And you'll find a lot of that is contract work, in particular in Asia and United Arab Republic. Effects of immigration. It's a large component of population change. Obviously, it's that out movement balancing the in movement. So overall, it affects population growth. And it has implications for planning all sorts of private and public services. So if you're planning on the grounds of immigration, you're used to be planning that they're all going to stay. But the data is telling us more and more are actually leaving. Immigration is not outweighing immigration, but it has to be taken into account. So it can represent a loss of skills and experience, as well as a loss of social investment in fields such as education, training, health services, and settlement costs of immigrants. So it's really saying what we were saying about developing countries losing people and their skills. It's the same effect when you're losing a lot of skilled people from a country. Are we then replacing it with immigrating skilled people from elsewhere? Settlement costs of immigrants mean we spend quite a lot on settling those immigrants. Therefore, it's a loss if they're not actually staying. Immigrants can help develop links between Australia and its trading partners by facilitating access to overseas markets for goods and services, Australian goods and services. And that's what we're talking about, the more positive aspect, clearly in terms of diaspora linked to their home countries. Immigrants may also send back substantial remittances and invest in foreign currency in Australia. And I said, if you looked at remittance data, we've got quite a lot of remittance coming back into the country. And people say, oh, isn't that all going to developing countries from developed countries? No, it can come back just simply because of circulation of different family members still supporting parents and others maybe back home, or children, maybe their own children that they've left families or whatever. Skilled immigration, 69% of people departing permanently or employment prior to leaving. So that is quite high. Almost 2/3 had a job before they left. And that shows up on these cards. The largest group of those employed, 42% were professionals, managers about 21%, and technical trade workers about 7.9%. Some of them occupations weren't stated. So what's it telling us? A lot of this movement is of employed people in skilled occupations. So we were saying about immigration, attracting skilled workers. We've got the same indication of what's happening of people moving out of Australia. They're also the most skilled of some of our occupational groups. But almost a third, including children, stated on their passenger cards they were not in the labour force or not in employment. That's probably a lot of wives, mothers, people following. And it could also be older people who generally have retired from the workforce. Now, we just need to understand net overseas migration. It's called NOM. So if I keep talking about NOM, I'm talking about net overseas migration. It excludes, if you look down here, short-term movements. Less than 12 months are not included when we calculate NOM. So those short-term movements, more likely to be visitors or people coming on business or conventions or whatever, aren't included in these figures. So NOM arrivals is the number of incoming travellers who stay in Australia for 12 months or more over a 16 months period, who are not currently counted in the population. They call them incoming travellers, not persons. They actually don't represent persons. Movement can be multiple moves and other moves as well. So we call them they call them travellers. Departures, the number of outgoing travellers, Australian residents and long-term visitors to Australia who leave Australia for 12 months or more over a 16-month period. It's given the flexibility of those 4 months to 16 months who are currently counted in the population. So this is where we establish net NOM, taking the arrivals away from the departures. So if you see graphs like this and you see NOM, that's net overseas migration. So this is your blue line. There's a break in the series in 2006, but don't pay too much attention to that. After that period, you can see where NOM sort of increases quite dramatically, drops back, and then increases again, and it's sort of gone down on a bit of a slide here as well. This is population growth, total population growth. So you can see just how that is affected. And obviously this is our natural increase, births minus deaths, which tends to trundle along but actually has increased in the recent decade, I guess. So these NOMs are the thing that most affect your overall total population growth in Australia. And we estimate NOM because it's not just the in-migrants, obviously. We need to look at those out-migrants, who they are and why are they leaving. These are net overseas migration departures by category, and this is in numbers up to 2014. It's the last figures I got. But it's roughly permanent migrants were highest 2009, 10, 11. They've dropped off a little bit as it looked. Skilled migrants, about 8%, about 8,000. Family, about 4,000 or 5,000. Humanitarian, these are our non-departures. What is my humanitarian telling me? Any clues? My refugee people? Did refugees? What's the zero? telling us about departures, or point 1.
Most of them are being settled.
Sorry?
Most of them are settling in Australia.
They have been settled, they're not leaving. They're a group that doesn't have as much choice. And basically, they've been settled in Australia. They're not amongst the big leavers. They're not really high amongst our departures. The highest group generally is clearly our permanent, skilled, who have got, and their families who can move. Temporary migrants, these fluctuate, but generally have gone up. These are temporary student visa migrants. These are leaving, but the numbers went up anyway, but we've got quite a lot of them leaving, obviously on completion of studies, on completion of student visas. These are 457s. They increased, but here we see those 457s are leaving. Why do you think they might be leaving in bigger numbers than they were 10 years ago? The temporary work visas, employer nominated, maybe mining industry and other things have gone bust or gone down, meaning there's not so much demand, and clearly those temporary workers are showing signs of departing. Working holiday makers, their numbers also went up, and there's quite a lot in those groups leaving. And clearly visitors make up a big part of those departures. New Zealand citizenship, New Zealand citizens, numbers have gone up. New Zealand maybe Australian economy has gone a bit off the boil. New Zealand's a bit better. You'll see them change a bit. So net overseas migration, norm. Median age, that's the numbers by state. Those are arrivals, median age of arrivals across all states around 26, 27 years of age. Okay, so it's relatively young movement. So this is your median age, 50% above that age, 50% below that age. Sex ratio, do we know how to read a sex ratio? 100 means you have an equal number of males and females in those streams. Over 100 means you've got more males. Under 100, you've got more females. So in those arrival ratios, you've basically got more males, and many more males going to the Northern Territory. It's only ACT, 99 below 100 says there's more females in that group. Overall, arrivals are male dominated, slightly. Departures, again, your departures are roughly 2 years older. So median age is 29, 28. Overall about 28 years of age. Sex ratio, again, all male and slightly more male dominated than the females. The ratio indicated here for arrivals. Some of that is females actually coming for marriage and actually staying within Australia in some of those figures, but generally very male dominated. There's been periods when it has been female dominated, but at the moment it looks very male dominated in terms of your norm, your net overseas migration arrivals. That's just citizenship. New Zealand, as I said, one of the biggest. These are arrivals and departures. Arrivals here, departures over here. Most of them are New Zealand citizens. Arrivals, largest component, 457s from UK, India, again 457s. China, students make up those groups, arriving and leaving. Working holiday makers, a lot from Ireland, coming and going. Philippines, 457s, and students leaving. South Africa, 457, so they're coming on work visas generally. Some of these, Malaysia, United States visitors, but generally we'll find most of them work visas or other sorts of visas. These arrivals and departure making up none overall. We'll find New Zealand, UK, India, People's Republic of China, Ireland, Philippines, South Africa, United States, etc. So clearly UNOM overall is very much dictated by how many arrivals, but also how many of them departing. And some of these are indicating percent females arrival. 47% means, if it was 50%, there's half females and males, but clearly there's less females coming and also going, as indicated in those sex ratios I showed you a minute ago. So reasons for emigration. Overseas born emigrants may return to their country of birth because of feelings of homesickness or insecurity, especially those leaving within a year or two of arrival. Usually indicates their families haven't come with them, so there's separation there, isolation, and one of the big reasons is family they'll go home for, particularly amongst the young people. Older immigrants sometimes depart after they retire. Widowhood and divorce can also motivate departures. Also, younger immigrants may also return to a country of birth because they are needed by their family in their former country, meaning they might need support or they just might want to go home to be family still. And also, Australian-born people, decision to leave permanently is usually based on economics, particularly employment. Some children born in Australia to former settlers eventually return to their parents to their country of origin. So there's a lot of those linkages that we actually have to look at when we do look at immigration. So on those departure cards we can get quite a lot of information, but we can't get exactly what was the reason they actually left Australia. So we were asked to do a survey. This is immigration from Australia and its economic implications. We did this for CEDA, which is our Centre for Economic Development in Australia, and at the time we also did it for the Department of Immigration. It was called Immigration and Multicultural Affairs, and we actually did work for them. They were concerned about these Australians leaving because it increased substantially, and so they wanted to know reasons for leaving, and they wanted to know if they were going to come back, their intentions to return. So the survey was designed to help explain immigration and establish economic effects, because we were working for the Centre for Economic Development in Australia as well. The reasons given from our survey, we sent a mail out, postal survey, to alumni graduates from universities in Australia. We were trying to target graduates, Australian graduates that actually recently had left. We also did an online version of the thing they could pass on to friends, and also through newsletters. Sometimes they weren't posted out because they had to be selected off university records. But Melbourne University, for example, were happy to put it in the newsletter they have, things like that. So we got a mixture of online responses back as well. However, we ended up with about 2,074 usable interviews, which was enough basically to say a few things about why. Better employment opportunities was the most important for males and for females. Professional development, more important for males, but quite high. Higher income, again, one of the drivers, particularly overall. This is ranked by the overall response here. Promotion, career advancement, also important for men. Lifestyle tend to be equal between men and women. Marriage, partnership, much more important for the females. and they were interviewed separately, not as households. Overseas job transfer, more important for males, education study, partners employment, much more so for females than males. Things like close to friends, family, established business, separation, divorce was very low on the list of some of those reasons. So you could say the economic opportunities, advancement, career was strong for both males and females. The reasons given for their benefits to Australia from their presence overseas by males and females, creating goodwill was response by both male and female. Skills transferable back to Australia, they could see that was important. Contacts were useful for other Australians. Linking two countries together, creating business links didn't get such a high response. We asked the question right near the end, do you still call Australia home? Trying to get a feeling for their relationship with Australia. Yes, 75% of males, higher for females, 85%. So they were living overseas, but they still had this link, or they still felt Australia to be home. No, 20% of males, females 12%, and a very low undecided. So fairly positive about still being linked to Australia as home. Intentions to return to live, about 50% said yes straight out. No was a bit higher for males than females, but undecided, about a third were undecided. And interestingly enough, more females were undecided than males, and they were mainly young or hadn't been there very long at this stage and hadn't actually decided whether they're going to settle or not. Intention to return to live by major destination country, much higher intentions coming out of Asia. When you look further into the data, a lot of them were on contract employment in Asia. But US, Canada, 44% were going to return, 35% undecided. UK, about 55%. So it did vary where they actually went. That's just broad reasons. Broad regions. And other overseas, about 50% were other countries of Africa and United Arab Republics or Europe. This question, intentions of males, females to return to live by birthplace of spouse. You might think this is a bit strange. And the Economic Development Authority didn't like us asking social questions either. But we were trying to establish if your partner overseas was overseas born, were you more likely to stay there than return? And it came out exactly as we expected. So if you had a spouse with an Australian birthplace, in other words, you're both Australian born, 62% yes, they were going to return, 73% of females. But if you had a spouse with a birthplace overseas, usually the country they were actually in, we found that was much lower and the no response much higher. So clearly it did play a role. I used to tell my friends with children going overseas, as long as they don't get married, they'll probably come back. If they get married, there's a greater risk that they'll stay there. The reason given for not wanting to return were just as important as those reasons of why they were going to return. And generally, better employment, these are ranked by actual response. Better employment opportunities here, so they went for employment opportunities and obviously they were staying for those opportunities as well. Established in a current location, very important for those who've been there longer. Career opportunities, again, high. Higher income here, again, all the ones that were high on the reasons seem to be remaining high on why they didn't return. Lifestyle more, or marriage keeps me here. Marriage, lifestyle more attractive here. family friends here because they'd established new friends, new relationships, new networks. Children growing up here, for example, no equivalent jobs in Australia, cost of relocating back to Australia, business opportunities, and some of these others. Custody of children proved to be pretty low, but generally economics was dictating as well as establishment. Reasons given to come back to Australia, those intending to return, was lifestyle. So 80% said lifestyle, 68% male, 75% of females again said family, but clearly work and education weren't top of the pops in terms of those. That was just a poor question. So we asked it in broad categories and we didn't really get any idea about what was good about the lifestyle or what was good about family. Some of the comments are good. At the end we said, tell us what you'd like to tell us that's not in the questionnaire basically. And so they had an open comment. There's just a couple of them. Australia is a great place. I feel that I can relate to Australians better than Europeans. I spent January in Australia, mostly in Adelaide. I fell in love with a guy there, but couldn't imagine moving back to live there. As far as gay liberation goes, Adelaide is where Europe was 20 years ago. This is an important issue for me, and if I moved back, I would move to Sydney. I intended to retire in Australia, but my wife wished to return to the US as she was ill and wanted to be close to her family. I find that I'm becoming more settled here and am developing contacts while losing some contact with friends in Australia. That and cost of relocating. I think, like a lot of young Australians, I love the country but feel no need to be there in my 20s. It is very exciting here. It was London actually. Lots of weekends away, interesting people, great opportunities. Weekends away could just be over to Paris or somewhere in Europe or Spain very quickly. I will go back to settle down, but most of my similarly minded Australian mates are here. The ones at home are tending towards getting married, having babies, and settling down for a smug, aren't we great existence. That is rankling for me at the moment. You really can't beat Australia for the weather, the food, the space, but at the moment central London is far more appealing. It is important that we encourage Australians, this is another one, to return home. The current taxation system is complicated and stifling, so that's one reason obviously home was not going to be very soon. Generally, advantages seen in Australia were family, security, cost of living. Want children to grow up Australian, and that was a lot of married couples that were Australian wanted to come back for their children. Lifestyle and ability to maintain international work networks. In an increasingly global market competing for skill, immigration policies have been important, reduce barriers to skill, targeting innovation and expertise, and increased barriers to unskilled and semi-skilled movement. In other words, encouraging the skilled movement but not necessarily very keen at all about unskilled or semi-skilled. So in conclusion, we need to track and monitor immigration. It's important that we do, and it's increasingly important with this real push now to looking at overseas diasporas and what roles they play for countries. We need to pay attention, or more attention anyway, to who leaves. There's a lot of evidence there. They were professionals, they were going for more employment opportunities overseas. They weren't coming back because they could see their employment opportunities, incomes more important where they were actually staying. So when we have policies to attract skilled migrants, we appear to be losing a lot of our skilled, similarly skilled residents. And the question is why? Why they leave? Can policy make an impact? Was only one I showed you said something about taxation. It was an issue. They didn't want to come back to the taxation systems we had here. Also, we're seeing the results of increasing skilled migration and the relaxation of visa requirements. That's not just in Australia doing that, it's other countries doing the same. So this is creating, if you like, the circulation of skilled workers here and elsewhere as well. Okay, so that's where immigration links very nicely to ASPROS, if that's the tutorial you're doing paper this week.